Emma Carter became Emma Langston. The world didn't see her as a CEO stepping into a new life. They saw her as the quiet, elegant bride who had married into one of the wealthiest families in the city. The ceremony was grand, every detail curated by Patricia Langston herself. Crystal chandeliers, a 10-tier cake, violins, and a guest list that read like a society registry. But Emma, wrapped in white lace with a soft smile on her face, was thinking of something else entirely, the life she was leaving behind. Behind her composed expression was a woman who had built sterling trust from a borrowed desk and a bold dream. But none of that mattered today. Today, she had chosen love. She had chosen Ryan, and with that choice came the decision to step away from the public spotlight, hand over the daily operations of the bank to her COO, and fade quietly into the background of her husband's powerful family. Ryan held her hand tightly that evening as they drove away from the reception. "They'll love you, Emma," he said, glancing at her with that warm, hopeful smile that made her believe in softer things. "Just give them time." She turned her face toward the window, watching the night blur into city lights. She didn't respond. Emma had always known what kind of family she was marrying into. The Langstons were polished, opinionated, and proud of their legacy. Ryan had warned her in gentle tones that his mother was traditional, that his sister could be intense, and that his brother was protective of the business. But Emma wasn't intimidated. She had walked into boardrooms filled with men who underestimated her and walked out with their funding and respect. She could handle the Langstons. Or so she thought. What she didn't realize yet was that this family wasn't looking to test her mind. They wanted to tame her spirit. And as she placed her hand gently over Ryan's, smiling through her silence, she whispered in her heart, "Let's see how far silence can go." The Langston estate sat like a fortress on the edge of the city, grand, sprawling, and cold. When Emma stepped through the tall iron gates with Ryan beside her, she could feel centuries of entitlement in the walls. Inside, the air smelled of expensive candles and quiet judgment. Patricia Langston didn't waste time with pleasantries. She examined Emma with a dispassionate smile, her eyes moving from the plain diamond on Emma's finger to the modest cut of her dress. "I suppose you prefer understated," she said, not as a compliment. Madison Langston, Ryan's younger sister, leaned against the banister with a glass of wine in her hand, smirking. "Or maybe she's just practical. That's a nice way of saying boring, right?" Ryan tried to laugh it off, but the tension in the room was thick, and Emma could feel the weight of being the outsider. Daniel, Ryan's older brother, shook her hand with a firm grip and a tone that barely masked his skepticism. "So, Emma, what do you do now that you're part of the family?" he asked. Emma met his eyes. "I breathe," she said softly. His smile faltered for half a second, and she knew they wouldn't forget that line, but they also wouldn't forgive it. That evening, over dinner, the insults were served with wine. Patricia dominated the conversation, speaking about lineage, true society, and how good wives know how to support their husband's future without stepping too far into it. Emma ate in silence, watching the dynamics unfold. Madison shared stories about her ex-model friends who knew how to fit into wealth without forcing it. Daniel spoke of the struggles of running the family furniture company, emphasizing how legacy was built on tradition, not ambition. Ryan tried to create balance, but every time he mentioned something good about Emma, the room would shift, eyes tightening, smiles stiffening. "She's lovely, but let's be honest," Patricia said, swirling her wine. "Emma isn't exactly what we expected for Ryan." Emma didn't flinch. She calmly placed her fork down and folded her napkin. "I imagine I'm not," she said, her tone gentle yet immovable. The silence that followed was thick and telling. Later that night, as Ryan rubbed her shoulder in apology, she simply whispered, "You don't have to protect me, Ryan. Just don't stand in my way." He looked at her, puzzled, but said nothing. The war had begun, quietly, and with tablecloths instead of swords. A week into living at the Langston estate, Emma learned something valuable. In a house like this, silence made people nervous. Patricia hated not knowing what Emma was thinking. She'd throw out questions under the guise of curiosity: where Emma's parents lived, what private schools she attended, why she didn't have old money friends. Emma responded with soft smiles and minimal detail. "I was too busy working," she said once. That answer annoyed Patricia the most. One afternoon, while Emma arranged flowers in the hallway, Patricia approached her with a glass of orange juice and an artificial smile. "You must be adjusting," she said. "Women like you usually do better in simpler settings." Emma didn't respond. She simply trimmed the stem of a rose. "You know, Ryan grew up in a world of expectations, and we've always had a certain standard. I hope you're not overwhelmed." Emma looked up, eyes clear. "I hope you're not underestimating me." Patricia blinked, her lips twitching. That was the last time she offered orange juice. Ryan began to notice the unease, but couldn't articulate it. Emma never complained. She kissed him goodnight, made coffee in the morning, and responded to Patricia's insults with effortless grace. But it gnawed at him. He once tried to speak up when Patricia commented on Emma's lack of family presence at a garden brunch. "Mom, enough," he said, but Patricia merely laughed. "Sweetheart, I'm just concerned. A woman's background matters. You can't plant a rose in cement and expect it to bloom." Emma remained still, her face composed. That night, Ryan apologized, tension in his shoulders. "They just don't know you yet," he whispered. "Maybe you could talk to them more. Share a bit of your world." Emma leaned against the bedroom window, watching the garden lights outside. "My world isn't something I owe anyone, Ryan," she said. "Not even your mother," he nodded, unsure whether to agree or defend. Emma had never raised her voice. She didn't slam doors or make demands. But the more she stayed quiet, the more the Langstons projected their own fears onto her. And in their eyes, silence wasn't wisdom, it was rebellion. Emma wandered the halls of the Langston estate like a ghost who refused to disappear. Each corridor held the weight of old portraits and inherited pride. The house was pristine, but beneath its polish was something colder, a culture of quiet control. Patricia ran the household like a boardroom. Dinner by 7, house staff on alert, and every family member expected to perform. One evening, as Emma reached for her own mail at the foyer, Patricia's voice cut across the room like a blade. "In this house, mail goes through the family office first." Emma paused. "I ordered a book," she replied. "No contracts, no secrets," Patricia smiled. "Good, because everything in this house runs through us." Emma didn't argue. She simply walked away and made a note to reroute all correspondence to a P.O. box downtown. Later that week, Emma tried to prepare dinner, a small gesture. But the chef, looking nervous, insisted that Mrs. Langston wouldn't like anyone else in the kitchen. Madison caught her setting the table and laughed. "We have staff for that. You're not on probation, you know." Emma gave a quiet smile and continued placing cutlery anyway. That night, at the table, Patricia announced, "Some people find comfort in performing servitude. Maybe it reminds them where they came from." Daniel chuckled. Ryan looked uncomfortable, but stayed silent. Emma picked up her glass and said softly, "Or maybe some people just like feeling useful in a house that does everything to make them feel invisible." The room froze. Patricia blinked slowly, and for the first time, no one had a comeback. Emma had said it without anger, without confrontation, just truth. And truth in this house, that was the loudest rebellion of all. It was Patricia's idea to issue Emma a family card, one tied to the Langston Central Expense Account, with strict monthly limits and an approval system for anything over a few $100s. She presented it over breakfast like a gift wrapped in control. "This is how we manage household spending," she said, sliding the sleek black card across the table. "We don't want our wives stressed over budgets." Emma accepted it with a smile, her fingers brushing the edge of the card like it was a page in a book she had already read. She knew what this meant. It wasn't generosity. It was a test of submission, a way to tether her to their system, to ensure every dress she wore, every bottle of wine she opened, every dinner she planned was paid for with their permission. Ryan didn't object. He kissed her on the forehead and whispered, "It's just for now, to keep the peace." Emma nodded and tucked the card into her purse, not because she needed it, but because she was beginning to understand the game. She stopped using her own cards for family purchases. She never brought up her private assistant, never mentioned the Sterling Trust concierge team that handled her investments behind the scenes. Let them think she was dependent. Let them feel superior. She used the family card to buy milk, toilet paper, and groceries, but only what was necessary. One afternoon, while reviewing household expenses in the study, Patricia clicked her tongue. "You're quite frugal," she said. "I expected more, shopping." Emma, seated quietly on the edge of the leather couch, replied, "I only spend what I'm given permission to." Patricia gave her a long look. "Good girl," she said with a nod, as if she'd trained a pet. But Emma wasn't performing submission. She was collecting behavior, documenting arrogance, mapping out every insult disguised as structure. The Langstons believed control equaled power, and Emma was beginning to see that their entire legacy depended on perception, not competence. Let them think she was small. Let them forget her name. She was the kind of woman who never needed to raise her voice to be heard. And someday, they'd realize too late that they gave her the keys to the kingdom, by mistake. The Langston autumn dinner party was a family tradition, a grand formal affair meant to showcase the estate and remind acquaintances of the Langston legacy. Emma dressed in a navy gown she'd worn once before, a subtle nod to simplicity. As she descended the grand staircase, the eyes of their guests turned, not in admiration, but in confusion. "That's Ryan's wife?" she overheard someone whisper. "She doesn't even wear statement jewelry." Madison, draped in sequins and ego, swept across the room to greet guests with false sweetness. During dinner, as the wine flowed and the conversation shifted to vacations, brands, and old friends from the Ivy League, Patricia looked down the table and asked with sharp casualness, "Emma, darling, where did you say you studied again?" The room grew quiet. Emma met her gaze unshaken. "Online," she said, "between managing a startup and taking night shifts." It wasn't glamorous, but it was effective. A few forks paused midair. Madison chuckled, "Well, at least you're honest. Most people try to fluff their background a bit when they marry up." Daniel laughed as well, adding, "Not everyone can come from old money, I suppose." Ryan glanced at Emma uneasy, but said nothing. He reached for her hand under the table. She didn't pull away, but she didn't hold on either. Emma simply finished her plate and smiled politely through the rest of the meal. Later that night, while she folded her dress and placed it gently back in its box, Ryan walked into the bedroom and wrapped his arms around her waist. "They were out of line," he whispered. "I'm sorry." Emma stared at their reflection in the mirror, both of them dressed for two different worlds. "I'm not," she said. "They're showing me who they are. And I always pay attention to people when they think I'm not a threat." Ryan didn't know what to say. He kissed her shoulder and said nothing. Emma tucked the dress away, but not the memory. It would serve her later, when appearances stopped protecting the people who lived behind them. The house was filled with whispers, and not all of them were behind closed doors. Emma had learned to walk softly, not to sneak, but to observe. One afternoon, as she stepped out of the east hallway into the courtyard, she paused just outside the open French doors. Inside, she heard Patricia's voice drifting from the drawing room, sharp and deliberate. "She's only with him for the money. Look at her, no real family, no pedigree. Just a clever face and enough manners to slip through the cracks." Madison giggled, her voice rising. "Honestly, I don't think she even loves him. She just knows how to act sweet. It's manipulation in heels." Daniel chimed in. "And don't get me started on that business background she claims to have. If she really ran something, we'd have heard of it. She's a well-dressed nobody." The words weren't even whispered. They were spoken with the boldness of people who had already made up their minds. Emma stepped back silently, retreating to her side of the mansion without anyone noticing. She didn't cry. She didn't even clench her fists. Instead, she sat at her writing desk and opened a blank page in her journal. She wrote down every word, not out of pain, but to remember. That night at dinner, she said nothing. She laughed softly when Daniel told another dismissive joke, and nodded politely when Patricia commented on her posture. Ryan remained oblivious, though he sensed something was wrong. As they got ready for bed, he watched her brush her hair in the dim light. "You've been quiet," he said. Emma smiled. "I've just been listening more lately." He looked confused, but she didn't elaborate. Let them think she was shrinking. Let them believe their words hadn't landed. The truth was, Emma was building something inside herself, a wall of truths that she would someday hand back to them, stone by stone. And when that day came, they would realize too late that the quiet girl they mocked had been the one taking notes the whole time. Ryan sat in his office, eyes flickering over spreadsheets he wasn't really reading. The sounds of footsteps and occasional clinks of dishes from downstairs filtered through the walls of the estate, but his mind wasn't on work. He kept replaying the past few weeks in his head, Emma's steady calm, the sharp edge behind her soft voice, and the growing tension that pulsed beneath every family dinner. He knew his family could be difficult, elitist even, but it had never been this. Venomous. And Emma, though graceful, was slipping into a quiet that no longer felt like peace. That night, as they sat beside each other in bed, he turned to her and whispered, "If they're making you feel like an outsider, you can tell me." Emma looked up from the book in her hands. "You already know," she said. "You just don't want to admit that doing something about it might cost you." Her words landed heavily. Ryan exhaled, guilt tightening around his chest. "I don't want to lose everything I've worked for," he said quietly. Emma closed her book. "Then don't be surprised when you lose me instead." At the next family meeting, Daniel presented a new expansion plan for Langston Interiors, and Patricia turned to Ryan for support. "You'll be involved, of course," she said. "We've kept you on the back seat too long." Ryan nodded, offering a non-committal response. But his eyes kept drifting toward Emma, who sat across the room in silence, legs crossed, observing. Madison chimed in, "Emma, you'll love this new showroom. We're bringing in pieces from Milan. You know what Milan is, right?" A few people chuckled. Ryan flinched. He opened his mouth to speak, but faltered. Emma held his gaze for a moment before standing to refill her glass. The message was clear. Ryan was straddling two worlds, and both were beginning to pull apart at the seams. That night, while Emma watered the succulents on the windowsill, Ryan stood behind her. "I want to fix it, Emma, I really do." She turned, her expression soft but distant. "You don't need to fix anything," she said. "You just need to decide who you are when no one's clapping." Then she turned off the faucet, leaving him alone in the silence he didn't yet know how to face. Emma didn't expect a grand gesture, but she did expect something. It was her birthday, not that she mentioned it aloud. She had never been one for fanfare. But in past years, even at the height of her career, her team at Sterling Trust would always surprise her with handwritten cards and a small cake. This year was different. The Langston household buzzed with activity, but none of it was for her. Madison was preparing for a photo shoot in the garden. Patricia was meeting a seamstress. Daniel had a meeting. No one said a word to Emma. By late afternoon, the truth settled in. They knew, and they chose to ignore it. She sat alone in the sunroom with a cup of tea, watching the light shift through the stained glass windows. Her phone buzzed, a message from an old friend. "Still can't believe you stepped away from everything. Happy birthday, Queen." Emma smiled faintly and turned her phone over. She didn't reply. That evening, Ryan returned home late with a small bouquet and a soft apology. "I'm so sorry, Em," he said, placing the flowers in her lap. "I thought Mom or Madison had something planned." "I assumed," Emma cut him off gently. "You assumed wrong." She stood and walked toward the window again, her back to him. "I don't need a celebration, Ryan. I just needed to not be invisible in a house I sleep in." Ryan moved behind her and placed his hands on her shoulders. "Let me make it up to you." She shook her head. "You keep asking for chances to make it up, but you're never there when it counts." There was no anger in her voice, just exhaustion. That night, Emma lit a single candle beside the bed, whispering a wish she didn't share aloud. Not for wealth, not even for love. She wished for clarity, the kind that tells you when a chapter is truly closing. And in the stillness of that room, she felt the shift. The version of Emma they had spent months trying to erase wasn't gone. She was simply waiting for the right moment to rise again. The first sign came at the self-checkout line. Emma stood at a high-end grocery store, her items already scanned, when the payment terminal flashed red. Transaction declined. She frowned, tried again. Same result. The store attendant stepped over. "Ma'am, would you like to try another card?" Emma's pulse remained steady, her face composed. "No, thank you," she said. She calmly put her items aside and walked out, her heels clicking against marble floors, her mind whirring. She knew she hadn't overspent, not even close. She called the bank linked to the Langston family account. "Yes, ma'am," the voice on the other end said. "This account was recently deactivated at the request of the primary holder, Patricia Langston." Emma ended the call, exhaled deeply, and walked to her car in silence. On the drive home, she didn't cry or scream. Instead, she smiled, not out of joy, but out of understanding. The curtain had dropped. The game had changed. Now she knew exactly how far they were willing to go to humiliate her. Back at the estate, she placed her purse on the foyer table and walked into the kitchen, where Madison and Patricia were sipping wine. "Everything all right?" Patricia asked, her voice laced with feigned concern. Emma gave a small nod. "My card didn't work. Apparently, it was deactivated." Madison grinned behind her glass. "Oops. Must have been some account management updates. You know how Mom keeps things tight." Emma smiled gently, of course. "Thank you for reminding me of the structure here." Then she turned and walked out. Patricia's smirk faded just slightly. Upstairs, Emma closed the door to her study and powered up her private laptop. Within seconds, she logged into her Sterling Trust dashboard. Her real accounts, the ones under her maiden name, blinked alive on the screen, the figures solid and undisturbed. She made a call to her personal financial assistant. "Suspend all activity temporarily. I'll explain later," she said. Then she sat back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. They thought they had cornered her. They thought cutting her off would make her dependent. But they had just activated the very side of her they feared the most, the woman who didn't need anyone's permission to exist. The next morning, Emma walked into the breakfast room as though nothing had happened. She wore a simple cream blouse and beige trousers, her hair pulled back with deliberate ease. The Langstons were already seated. Patricia reading the financial pages, Madison scrolling through her phone, and Daniel sipping espresso. Emma sat quietly and reached for a croissant. That was when Madison glanced up, her voice too sweet. "Did you get everything sorted out with your little card issue?" Emma looked up with soft eyes. "Oh yes, thank you. I was told it was a decision from the head of the household." Patricia folded her newspaper and smiled thinly. "We run a tight ship, dear. It's not personal. We just believe in discipline." Emma nodded once. "Of course, discipline is important." Madison giggled and leaned back in her chair. "If you want to use the family account, Emma, just ask nicely. You know, like you actually need it." Daniel laughed under his breath. Emma folded her napkin, stood up calmly, and looked straight at Madison. "Thank you. I'll remember that next time I want to buy bread." The air in the room shifted. Madison's smirk wavered slightly, but she said nothing. Emma walked out of the dining room and into her study, where she closed the door quietly behind her. She picked up her private phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in months. "Mr. Levin," she said when the line connected, "it's Emma Carter Langston. I need you to prepare a temporary freeze on all personal activity. Don't panic, just a personal project." On the other end, the man responded, "Understood. Is there a timeline?" Emma looked out the window, her voice quiet but unwavering. "No timeline. I'm just giving certain people the illusion of control. I need to see how far they'll go." After the call, she sat still, the morning sun casting a golden sheen on her skin. It wasn't humiliation that had broken her. It was the realization that her silence had become their arrogance. And now, she would give them enough rope. What they chose to do with it was entirely their decision. Emma's study had always been a quiet sanctuary, but now it became a war room. She placed a glass of water beside her laptop and opened the Sterling Trust private management dashboard. Her real identity, still protected under her maiden name, lit up on the screen in digits that would silence every Langston laugh. Her ownership was intact. Her stakes in real estate, tech portfolios, and discrete international accounts were active. She had always preferred staying invisible, but now she understood that invisibility wasn't protection, it was preparation. She opened another tab and reviewed the Langston family's publicly visible financial structures. One look at their holdings told her all she needed to know. They were overstretched, operating on borrowed prestige and paper-thin liquidity. Daniel's company was bleeding cash. The mansion they mocked her in was tied up in loans with ballooning interest. She sat back, crossing her arms. "They're living on illusion," she whispered. and they think I'm the guest in their house. She called her assistant again. Put all my current outgoing transactions under review. Delay any automatic renewals, and reroute all mail to the downtown address, she instructed. Any particular reason? He asked. Emma responded simply, because I want them to believe I've vanished into their version of poverty. After ending the call, she reached for a box she hadn't touched since her wedding. It contained the original deed papers to a property the Langstons didn't know she owned. One of their summer homes in Montauk had been refinanced with funds from Sterling Trust 5 years ago. Emma had quietly acquired it when the original buyer defaulted. They never asked who the silent investor was. Now, they were living on land partially owned by the very woman they thought was surviving off allowances. She closed the box and exhaled. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about reclaiming space. It was about principle. They had used wealth as a weapon, unaware that the richest person in their orbit never had to lift her voice. Emma wasn't building her exit. She was building their education. And when the time came, she would let them fail, not from cruelty, but from the very pride they weaponized against her. Emma stepped into her role like an actress handed a script she had already memorized. She allowed Madison to take her shopping, not to buy anything, but to stand beside her as a lesson in misjudgment. "Oh my God, Emma, try this one," Madison exclaimed in the boutique, holding up a loud floral dress. Emma smiled politely, slipping into a dressing room only to emerge 10 minutes later with nothing in her hands. "Nothing fit quite right," she said. "I suppose some clothes aren't made for everyone." Madison, missing the layered meaning, rolled her eyes. "You need to learn to shop better. Honestly, I don't know what you wore before you married my brother." Emma replied gently, "I wore results, and they always fit." At lunch, when the bill came, Madison theatrically pulled out the Langston card and offered a fake sigh. "Don't worry, I've got this. You're family now, even if you're not on the account anymore." Emma thanked her with the same grace she would use at a coronation. Back home, she unpacked a few gift bags filled with trinkets Madison had bought, candles, overpriced lotions, and novelty items Emma would never use. Patricia passed by her room, glanced at the bags, and said, "See, Madison's warming up to you. You should be grateful." Emma nodded. "I am. It's nice to feel supported." That evening, she joined them for dinner in a plain black dress with no accessories. Daniel joked, "Minimalism again? You really take the poor girl aesthetic seriously." Emma responded without blinking, "It teaches resilience. You should try it, Daniel. It might help with your quarterly losses." The room quieted. Madison's fork paused midair. Patricia stared, lips pursed. Ryan looked down, struggling to contain both pride and fear. Emma finished her soup, folded her napkin, and rose from the table. "Thank you for dinner," she said. "It's good to be reminded of how much people say when they believe they're never being challenged." Upstairs in her study, she recorded everything in her notebook, each jab, every chuckle, each dismissal. They thought they were building her story, but what they didn't know was she was writing theirs. Ryan stood in the hallway outside their bedroom, watching Emma through the half-open door as she folded laundry in silence. She was wearing an old sweater, one he hadn't seen her touch in years. It was faded, soft at the elbows, something she would have never worn out in public before. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, wondering when exactly she had stopped going on spa days or even ordering her favorite tea blends. "You've been dressing differently," he said finally, stepping into the room. Emma looked up with a faint smile. "Am I?" He nodded. "And I haven't seen you shop for yourself in months. Not even a new book. That's not like you." She sat on the edge of the bed, her gaze calm. "I'm learning what it means to adapt," she said. "That's what everyone wants, right?" Ryan's brow creased. "Emma, what's really going on?" "You're disappearing into this version of yourself that isn't you." She stood and touched his cheek. "Maybe this is exactly who I need to be for now." Later that evening, Ryan spoke with his mother in the library. "She's been different," he said. "Withdrawn." Patricia sipped her tea, not looking up from her tablet. "She's finally learning her place, dear. That's not a bad thing." Ryan's voice rose slightly. "Learning her place? She's my wife, Mom, not a child to be trained." Patricia finally looked at him, expression cool. "We built this house with standards. If she doesn't meet them, she will always feel like an outsider. Ryan clenched his fists but said nothing. That night, he returned to Emma and found her standing at the balcony, looking out over the gardens. He wrapped his arms around her waist. "What are they doing to you?" he whispered. She didn't turn. "Nothing I haven't let them do." He kissed her shoulder and asked, "How do I make this right?" Emma finally turned, eyes tired but composed. "You don't," she said. "But you can start by deciding whether your comfort is worth more than my dignity." Her words pierced the silence. Ryan stood there, realizing that love alone wasn't enough, not when it came with quiet complicity. The charity gala was a grand affair, gold drapes, champagne towers, and camera flashes flickering like fireflies. The Langstons were one of the headline sponsors, and Patricia made sure the whole city knew it. She arrived in a deep emerald gown, Madison trailing behind her in silk, both of them glowing with entitlement. Emma, dressed in a muted burgundy dress with her natural hair in a sleek twist, walked 2 steps behind, unannounced and unadorned. As the MC introduced the family on stage, Patricia took the microphone and offered thanks to the donors, pausing only to gesture at Emma. "And of course my son's wife, Emma," she said. "A lovely homemaker. She's learning the ropes of what it means to support a man of legacy." There was polite laughter from the crowd. Emma stood still, smiling faintly, while her hands curled into fists behind her clutch. After the applause faded, Ryan turned to his mother sharply. "Why did you say that?" he asked. "You made her sound like furniture." Patricia waved her hand dismissively. "Don't be dramatic. It's better than calling her unemployed." Madison giggled and added, "She should be glad she's even on stage." A few years ago, no one would have given her a second glance. Emma didn't respond. She simply walked off the stage and stood alone by the edge of the ballroom, watching a waiter refill glasses. One of the guests, a man she recognized from an old investment firm, approached her. "You're Emma Carter, aren't you?" "Of Sterling Trust?" he whispered. Emma smiled. "I used to be. Now I'm a lesson in misjudgment." He blinked, confused, but before he could say more, she walked away. Later that night, as the Langstons laughed in the car on the way home, Emma sat by the window, staring out into the dark. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She simply etched the moment into memory, knowing that humiliation was sometimes a necessary seed for vindication, and tonight they had watered it themselves. Emma stared at herself in the mirror, studying the tired reflection that blinked back at her. The woman she saw looked nothing like the polished executive who once closed 8-figure deals in quiet boardrooms. Her eyes were slightly dimmer, her posture a little more reserved. But there was something else, something sharper hidden beneath the surface. She leaned closer, touching the skin under her eyes. "They think this is defeat," she whispered to her reflection. "But it's not, it's calculation." She stepped back and opened her closet, pulling out a dress she hadn't worn in years, an elegant midnight blue sheath, tailored to command a room. She ran her fingers over the fabric, remembering how it felt to own a space with presence alone. Folding it carefully, she placed it back into a hidden compartment behind the shelf, not for now, but for when the moment was right. She wasn't preparing to leave. She was preparing to reclaim. That night, she sat by the window, writing in her journal. Each entry was time-stamped and detailed, not just what was said, but who said it, how they looked when they said it, and who stayed silent. Ryan walked in and saw the open book. "You've been writing more lately," he said gently. "Are you planning something?" Emma looked up. "Yes," she replied. "I'm planning not to forget." He sat beside her, unsure of what to say. After a pause, he murmured, "I hate what this house is doing to you." Emma turned the page and began writing again. "It's not doing anything to me, Ryan. It's showing me what happens when people mistake quiet for weakness." The words hung in the air like prophecy. Ryan kissed her forehead before retreating, leaving her in the glow of her thoughts. Emma knew she had been patient long enough. Her silence had been mistaken for surrender, but it was something far more dangerous. It was strategy. And when the curtain rose on her next act, there would be no need for applause. Only recognition. The invitation never came, but Emma knew about the shopping party anyway. She overheard Madison boasting about it during a phone call on the patio. "Just the girls who matter," she'd said, followed by the sharp giggle that always preceded a jab. Emma wasn't surprised. Still, something in her stirred when she saw the sleek cars lining the Langston driveway that afternoon. Women in designer sunglasses and flowing dresses walked into the estate carrying expensive leather purses, laughing like royalty. Emma stood at the top of the stairs watching them enter, invisible yet present. Patricia walked past her without a word, but Madison paused briefly and said with an arched brow, "Oh, didn't think you'd be around today. It's kind of an exclusive thing. You probably wouldn't enjoy it." Emma smiled. "You're right. I prefer my investments to appreciate in value." Madison didn't catch the shade, or pretended not to, and strutted away. An hour later, Emma walked into the lounge where the women had gathered. They fell silent, mid-laughter, as she entered, not because she was unwelcome, but because her presence disrupted their hierarchy. She wore a modest dress, hair in a simple bun, no visible designer labels, and yet she carried herself like someone who needed no permission. One of the guests, clearly trying to break the tension, offered her a drink. Emma accepted, then listened as they chatted about international boutiques and men they'd outgrown. Madison, emboldened by the wine, leaned forward and said loud enough for all to hear, "Emma here is kind of like our family's project. We're polishing her up." Laughter rippled across the room. Emma sipped her drink and responded evenly, "That's generous of you, though I'd advise against polishing something you don't understand. It tends to lose its value in careless hands." The room quieted. A few guests blinked, clearly unsure whether it was an insult or advice. Madison turned red but forced a chuckle. Emma stood gracefully. "Thank you for the hospitality," she said, placing her glass down. "It's always enlightening to see how people act when they think they're surrounded by mirrors." She left without waiting for a response. Outside, the autumn wind danced through her hair, but she walked tall. They had laughed at her again, but that day she'd marked the end of their monopoly on the narrative. Daniel Langston stood in his office staring at the latest financial report, his jaw clenched and eyes rimmed with exhaustion. Langston Interiors, the family's once proud furniture company, was bleeding funds. Delayed shipments, poor sales, and 2 failed product launches had left the company scrambling to stay afloat. The bank had given a final warning: pay the outstanding interest within 60 days or forfeit one of their warehouses. But Daniel couldn't admit this to the family. Pride was the Langston currency, and to acknowledge failure would be social death. He paced the room, drafting excuses in his head: the market, bad suppliers, temporary cash flow issues, anything but the truth. He thought of calling Ryan, but stopped himself. Ryan was too clean, too unsure. And Emma? No, she was still an outsider. They'd never give her that satisfaction. At dinner that night, Daniel was uncharacteristically quiet. Patricia chatted about an upcoming charity gala, while Madison bragged about a new stylist. Emma watched Daniel closely, the way his fork scraped his plate, how he didn't look anyone in the eye. She had seen that kind of silence before. It wasn't arrogance, it was panic. After dinner, she passed by his office and paused in the hall, listening to him argue on the phone. "We can't lose another location." "No, I'm handling it. The board doesn't need to know. Just stall them." Emma stepped away before she was noticed. Back in her room, she opened her private laptop and searched Langston Interiors through confidential financial archives. What she saw confirmed everything. They were dangerously over-leveraged, relying on family name and borrowed funds. A single nudge or a single rejection could collapse their house of cards. She stared at the screen for a long time. Ryan entered quietly and sat beside her. "You okay?" he asked. Emma nodded. "Just watching someone dig a hole he can't climb out of." Ryan didn't ask who. He didn't need to. But what he didn't realize was the shovel Daniel was using. It had Sterling Trust's logo on the handle. The following weekend, the Langstons gathered in the drawing room for a family update that Daniel had initiated. Emma sat in her usual corner seat, legs crossed, silent, as the others chatted over coffee and pastries. Daniel cleared his throat and stood, holding a set of printed documents. "Langston Interiors is preparing to scale," he announced. "We're aiming for expansion into 2 new states by next quarter." Patricia clapped lightly. "That's wonderful, Daniel." Madison added, "About time." The old showrooms are practically fossils. Daniel nodded, carefully choosing his next words. For this, we'll be needing a funding partner. And I've identified the perfect institution, Sterling Trust. At the mention of the name, Emma's fingers froze around her teacup. Her expression didn't change, but inside, a fire had been lit. I've been speaking to someone in their commercial division, Daniel continued. With our name, securing a loan should be a formality. Emma glanced at Ryan, whose face remained blank. No one looked in her direction. No one thought to ask if she had an opinion about a bank she had once built from the ground up. Patricia beamed. That's perfect. That bank has taste, and they'll love doing business with a name like Langston. Emma set her teacup down. Do you know who you're speaking to there? She asked, her tone neutral. Daniel waved a hand dismissively. Just a senior manager. Doesn't matter who, really. Once they see our name, it's a done deal. Madison chimed in. Honestly, if they don't approve us, they must be crazy. We're practically royalty around here. Emma leaned back in her chair, letting the weight of their confidence fill the room like smoke. They were walking into a lion's den, completely unaware that the lion was seated right in front of them. And she wouldn't roar. She wouldn't warn. She would simply wait. And when the time came, the only thing louder than her silence would be the sound of their pride collapsing around them. Emma stood by the kitchen counter slicing apples when Ryan walked in with a rare look of excitement. He dropped a thick manila folder on the marble and kissed her cheek. Good news. Daniel's finally making a solid move. He's securing a partnership with Sterling Trust, he said, not noticing the flicker in Emma's eyes. He's confident the loan will pull Langston Interiors back on its feet. It's all being arranged through their commercial division. Emma continued slicing without reacting, her movements steady. That's ambitious, she murmured. Brian nodded. It'll restore the family's reputation, Em. And Daniel says they won't even need to go through the full process. Just the Langston name is enough to push it through. She wiped her hands on a cloth and turned to face him. And what if it's not enough? Ryan frowned. Come on. Sterling Trust isn't going to turn us down. The name alone opens doors. Emma smiled faintly. Sometimes doors don't open because of a name. Sometimes they close tighter. Later that evening, Emma returned to her study and pulled out her laptop. She scrolled through Sterling Trust's internal notifications. Her clearance level gave her access to everything. There it was, a preliminary application from Langston Interiors, flagged for review due to inconsistent cash flow and incomplete financials. She read every line, her lips pressed together. They hadn't even submitted a full report, just wrote in on their name, assuming it would carry weight. She closed the file and leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. Her heart ached, not because she wanted to destroy them, but because she now had no reason to protect them. Ryan was still blind to the arrogance around him, still holding on to hope that his family could change. But Emma had learned the hard way that some people didn't evolve. They just clung harder to the structures that made them feel superior. She reached for her journal and wrote one line under that day's date. They will walk into my empire expecting favor and find themselves denied entry at the front door. The next morning, Emma sat at the head of her desk reviewing Sterling Trust's high-priority portfolios. She treated it like any other professional matter, clean, methodical, emotion-free. But when she opened the Langston Interiors file again, she allowed herself a full, uninterrupted read. She wasn't looking for flaws, they were already glaring. She was calculating impact. The numbers were worse than expected. Loan liabilities outweighed incoming revenue projections, and there were silent withdrawals from personal equity lines Daniel hadn't disclosed. They were not only sinking, they were trying to leverage collateral that didn't even belong to them. Emma flagged the account for elevated scrutiny and added a red marker note. Due diligence required. Reassess family-linked liabilities. Applicant conflict of interest. She sat still for a moment, watching her own note on screen. She had just signed a decision that would derail an empire, one built on ego and entitlement, and no one in that household even knew she had the power to do so. As she closed the laptop, a soft knock came at the door. Ryan peeked in. You've been locked in here all morning. Everything all right? She nodded. Just some housekeeping. He walked in and leaned against the doorway. I keep thinking about what you asked me last week, about whether my comfort is worth your dignity. Emma looked up, and Ryan sighed. I don't want to lose either of them, but I'm starting to realize I can't have both. She studied him for a moment before saying, That's the first honest thing you've said about this family in a long time. He stepped closer. What if this loan really helps Daniel? What if it turns things around for them? Emma stood and walked to the window. Then they'll owe their survival to a woman they tried to erase. The irony would be poetic, but I have a feeling they're about to learn something far more humbling. Ryan's eyes darkened with curiosity. You sound like you know something. Emma gave a soft laugh. Darling, I know everything. And with that, she left the room, leaving him staring after her, a man finally beginning to see that the storm he feared wasn't approaching. It was already in the house. Ryan sat alone in his study, flipping through the sterling trust documents Daniel had printed for their internal prep. He wasn't a finance expert, but the numbers confused him. Something wasn't adding up. Out of idle curiosity, he opened his laptop and searched Sterling Trust's leadership page. His eyes scanned the familiar faces until he froze. There in black and white was a portrait of Emma Carter Langston, listed as founder and chairwoman emeritus. His heart dropped. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. He clicked the bio link, and the accolades flooded in. Emma had started the bank, run it for nearly a decade, and had quietly stepped down from public duties only 2 years ago. It wasn't just a bank, it was her bank. The same bank his family had now arrogantly applied to for a rescue. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the discovery pressing on his chest like stone. She never told me, he whispered. All this time. He found Emma in the garden, tending to her flowers. She looked serene, as if her world wasn't burning in quiet irony. Emma, he said, his voice hoarse. She turned unsurprised. You found out. He nodded. You built it? You've been watching them apply to your bank for help? She stood and dusted her palms. Yes. Ryan stepped closer, hurt warring with awe in his eyes. Why didn't you tell me? Emma met his gaze without flinching. Because you still needed to see who they were without my protection. His voice cracked. But you let them strip you down. You let them mock you, starve you of dignity. She tilted her head. And in doing that, I let them show me the truth. That's more valuable than approval, Ryan. He sat on the stone bench beside her, face buried in his hands. What happens now? He asked. Emma looked out at the horizon. Now, I decide if they're worth saving, and what saving them will cost them. The wind rustled through the garden as Ryan sat beside the woman he now realized he had never fully seen. She wasn't just his wife. She was the empire his family had mistaken for silence. The house was still when Emma entered their bedroom, save for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock outside the door. Ryan sat on the edge of the bed, staring into his hands like he was holding a fragile truth he didn't know how to carry. Emma stood at the window for a moment, watching her reflection in the dark glass before turning to him. You want to talk? She asked softly. Ryan looked up, his voice dry. I don't even know where to start. She crossed the room and sat beside him, her posture unguarded. Then start with how you feel. He shook his head. I feel ashamed, not of you, of myself. I let them humiliate you, starve you of honor, while you sat on a throne they never even knew existed. Emma placed her hand on his. I wasn't looking for applause, Ryan. I just wanted to know if you would ever see me clearly when there was nothing left for them to give you. Ryan turned to her, his voice trembling. Why didn't you trust me with who you were? Emma inhaled deeply. Because trust isn't just about knowing someone's truth. It's about how they handle it. You loved me, yes. But you were still afraid of losing them. I needed to see if your love could stand on its own without their approval. Silence settled like a blanket between them. Then Ryan said, You've been fighting this whole time, haven't you? Emma nodded. Not for revenge. For boundaries. For peace. For space to be respected without having to roar to be heard. He squeezed her hand, eyes glossy. I want to be the kind of man who deserves you. Emma smiled faintly. Then stop asking me for forgiveness you never earned and start making decisions that show me I matter more than your family's pride. That night, they didn't sleep in each other's arms. Instead, they sat facing one another, two people rebuilding something honest from the ruins of politeness and silence. And as the first light of morning crept through the curtains, Ryan finally saw Emma, not as his wife, not as the outsider his family dismissed, but as the quiet storm that had held back only out of mercy. The next morning, Ryan stood in the Langston family boardroom, the same space where he had once been praised for carrying the family name, never for making his own decisions. Daniel was mid-sentence about quarterly projections when Ryan raised a hand. "I'm stepping down from all Langston Interiors affairs," he said calmly. The room fell into stunned silence. Patricia blinked slowly, as if trying to interpret a language she didn't recognize. "Excuse me?" she asked. Ryan met her eyes. "I won't be part of a company that's built on exclusion and entitlement." Daniel scoffed. "You're being dramatic." Ryan stood, sliding a sealed envelope across the table. "These are my shares. I'm transferring them back to the family. You can do what you like with them." "I'm done." Patricia's voice rose. "And where do you think you'll go, Ryan? You think that woman can give you what we built?" He didn't flinch. "She already gave me everything you couldn't, Integrity." Back at home, Ryan walked into the kitchen where Emma was brewing tea. She turned to him, studying his face. "You look lighter," she said. He nodded. I walked away. She raised a brow. "From what?" "From pretending," he replied. "From acting like silence was peace. I gave them back their name, their shares, and their conditions. They have everything, except me." Emma stared at him for a long moment. "And what about you?" she asked. "What do you have now?" Ryan took her hand. "You. And that's all I'll ever need." She searched his face for signs of doubt, but found none. For the first time since their wedding, Emma saw a man who wasn't trying to juggle both worlds. He had made a choice. Not because she demanded it, not because she cornered him, but because he realized who had been holding him together all along. And for Emma, that was the only apology she ever needed. The Langston family arrived at Sterling Trust's towering headquarters with the pomp of people expecting applause. Patricia wore her signature ivory suit, Madison in heels that screamed luxury, and Daniel carrying a sleek leather binder like a war general ready to make demands. "This is formality," he said as they stepped into the gold-trimmed elevator. "We'll have them eating out of our hands by the end of the meeting." None of them noticed the receptionist's subtle bow when Emma's name was mentioned. They sat in the grand boardroom, marveling at the view, complimenting the art on the walls, unaware that their arrogance was being timed, recorded, and filed away by professionals who already knew who would walk away from the table empty-handed. The assistant entered, offering water and notepads. "The chairwoman will be with you shortly," she said. Patricia arched a brow. "Female leadership. I like that. Hopefully, she's someone who respects influence." When the glass door opened, they turned and froze. Emma stepped in, composed and radiant in a deep navy pantsuit, every inch the executive they had mocked in silence for months. Behind her, her assistant carried a thick file with the Langston application stamped in red. Daniel stood too quickly, voice caught in his throat. "Emma?" Patricia's mouth parted, but no sound came out. Madison sat stiffly, her face draining of color. Emma walked to the head of the table, placed her hands gently on the surface, and said, "Thank you for waiting. Let's begin." The tension in the room was a living thing. Not anger, not fear, just recognition that they had never known the woman seated before them. Emma opened the folder calmly. "We'll review your proposal, but I want to remind you that Sterling Trust has strict ethical standards. Legacy isn't a substitute for merit here." Daniel tried to recover. "We had no idea," she cut him off. "That I was capable, that I was powerful, or just that I wasn't dependent on your approval." The room fell silent again. They had come for money. But what they got was a mirror, and for the first time, none of them liked what they saw. The room remained suspended in breathless silence as Emma took her seat at the head of the table. Her chair was slightly elevated, her name engraved on the gold plate before her. Emma Carter Langston, founder and chairwoman. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. The silence was enough. Patricia adjusted in her chair, her composure cracking. "Emma," she began, her tone strained. "You never mentioned this." Emma's gaze was steady. "I wasn't obligated to. You made it clear what you believed I was worth, and I allowed you to show it without interference. Daniel leaned forward, voice low. This changes things. Emma tilted her head. No, Daniel. It reveals them. I didn't change. You just never looked. Madison, visibly pale, tried to muster a laugh. So, what now? Are we supposed to beg? Emma opened the folder. No, you're supposed to answer for your numbers. This is a financial institution, not a stage. She began to review their proposal line by line, each figure another nail in the coffin of entitlement. Your projected returns are optimistic at best, misleading at worst, she said, turning a page. And this liability section, you're attempting to leverage a property that is already under sterling trust ownership. Daniel blinked. That's impossible. Emma closed the file. I bought the Montauk property through a silent partnership 3 years ago, the same year your loan defaulted. Patricia's face drained of color. You let us live on land you owned. Emma's voice was calm. No, I let you mock a woman who owned the roof over your head. You just never asked the right questions. Ryan watched from the side, silent, proud, and now finally aware of the depth of the woman he married. Emma pushed the folder toward them. We'll send you a formal rejection tomorrow. You're free to reapply, but I suggest you come with more than a family name. She stood, meeting each of their eyes. Meeting adjourned. And as she walked out, her heels clicking against the marble, the Langstons sat frozen, no longer in control, no longer powerful, and no longer blind to the woman they had tried to shrink. Regrets to inform you that your application for funding has been declined due to failure to meet core standards of transparency and financial stability. There were no pleasantries, no doors left open, just a clear message. The bank didn't bend for arrogance. Patricia read it over breakfast and nearly dropped her coffee. She embarrassed us, she said, voice trembling. Daniel paced the room in disbelief. She humiliated us publicly, in front of her entire staff. That boardroom was full of people who knew, who watched us beg. Madison stared at the wall, lips tight. And we can't even retaliate. She didn't scream. She didn't insult us. She just let the facts speak. Patricia snapped. She planned this. She waited for the right moment. Madison muttered. We handed it to her. Later that day, Patricia called Ryan. You need to control her, she demanded. She's making us look like fools. Ryan answered with a steadiness they hadn't heard from him before. You did that yourselves. There was a pause on the line. What are you saying? Patricia asked. I'm saying, Ryan continued, that Emma doesn't owe you silence anymore. She gave you dignity when you gave her scorn. She gave you restraint when you gave her cruelty. And she still didn't humiliate you. She simply told the truth. Patricia's voice cracked. So you're taking her side? I'm choosing the side that chose me, he replied. Then he ended the call. That night, Emma received a message from an old colleague who had been in the Sterling Trust lobby during the meeting. You didn't need to raise your voice. You made the room listen with your presence. Emma closed the message with a quiet nod to herself. She hadn't needed revenge. She had just needed the truth to have a voice. And now it had spoken loud enough for the entire city to hear. 2 days after the meeting, Emma sent an official letter to the Langston legal team outlining a reassessment of their tenancy at the Montauk property. She had never intended to enforce eviction, not really, but she needed them to know that every inch of the space they had claimed as theirs had been hers all along. It was poetic justice, not legal warfare. She received no reply, but the silence was more satisfying than protest. Later that week, she attended a fundraising gala for female entrepreneurs, one she had funded anonymously for years. A local reporter approached her, microphone in hand. You've remained private about your business journey, Mrs. Langston, but many are calling this the most graceful corporate takedown in years. What's your response to that? Emma smiled gently. I wasn't trying to take anyone down, she replied. I was simply reclaiming what never should have been taken from me, respect. Back at the estate, Patricia sat on the back porch, staring at the garden Emma once tended. Madison broke the silence with a whisper. She was right here, and we never saw her. Patricia didn't respond. Instead, she reached into her purse and pulled out an old invitation from their welcome dinner. Emma's name had been misspelled, written in smaller font. We dismissed her before she had a chance, she finally said. Daniel joined them, rubbing his temples. She owned the house. She owned the bank, and we treated her like she was a burden. Madison whispered. She owned us, and we laughed in her face. In the city, Emma sat across from Ryan in their new apartment, far from the Langston estate, far from entitlement. He raised a glass. To truth, he said. Emma raised hers. To clarity. Then she added, almost to herself, and to the beautiful irony of being the owner of the house they once locked me in, while they thought I was lucky to sleep there. And when she smiled, it wasn't for revenge. It was for peace, the kind only truth can buy. Emma stood in the middle of their new living room, walls still bare, the scent of fresh paint lingering in the air. It was smaller than the estate, quieter, but filled with something she hadn't felt in months. Freedom. She set the last book on the shelf when her phone buzzed. It was a message from Patricia. We need to talk. This silence is beneath all of us. Emma stared at the screen for a long moment before deleting it. That evening, Ryan approached her with a printed letter he had drafted. I want your eyes on this, he said. It was a formal notice cutting all financial and business ties with the Langstons, complete with account closures, withdrawal of rights to joint properties, and a firm message of non-contact. They won't stop unless I draw the line, he said. Emma read the letter, made one correction, then handed it back. Add one more line at the end, she said. They're no longer welcome in our lives in any form. 2 days later, they invited Patricia, Daniel, and Madison for a final meeting, not at Sterling Trust, but at a neutral office space Emma had rented. There was no luxury, no press, just a plain conference table and 3 folding chairs waiting. Emma and Ryan sat across from them, a printed document in front of each guest. This is your closure, Emma began. You can read it, or you can leave, but you won't see us again. Patricia looked stunned. You're cutting us off, Ryan nodded. Completely. Daniel slammed his palm on the table. You're choosing her over blood. Emma turned to him, calm as stone. Blood doesn't excuse cruelty. Family without respect is just proximity. Madison laughed bitterly. So that's it? You're erasing us? Emma stood. No, I'm preserving myself. And Ryan's choosing peace. Patricia stared at her son. You're really doing this? Ryan took Emma's hand. I already did. They left the room as the Langstons sat speechless behind them. The door didn't slam, it simply clicked shut. And for the first time, it stayed that way. Morning light streamed through the sheer curtains of their new home as Emma brewed coffee in the quiet. She stood barefoot on hardwood floors, her robe soft against her skin, watching the city wake beneath her window. There was no tension in her shoulders, no rehearsed silence in her throat. Ryan appeared behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, pressing his cheek against hers. You slept well, he said. She nodded. For the first time in years, I woke up without armor. They drank in silence for a while, leaning into each other, no longer needing to fill the spaces with words. Later that afternoon, Emma returned to Sterling Trust headquarters for the first time in weeks. Her executive team stood in the lobby when she arrived, greeting her with quiet admiration. Welcome back, Chairwoman, her assistant said. Emma gave a small smile. I never left. I just gave others the space to show me who they were. As she walked through the glass doors of her office, Emma paused at the threshold, looking out at the skyline. Behind her, the nameplate gleamed in gold. She had built this empire stone by stone, not to impress, not to conquer, but to provide the very thing she had just reclaimed, dignity. She sat at her desk and opened a fresh page in her journal. At the top, she wrote the final entry. Power is never in noise, it's in knowing you can rebuild after being torn apart and never needing to say, I told you so. Outside the building, the world moved on. The Langstons faded into their own shadows, no longer a name whispered in elite circles, but a lesson in what happens when you underestimate grace. Meanwhile, Emma stood tall, not because she fought to be seen, but because she proved that the woman they tried to silence had always owned the room. She didn't slam doors. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stood in the doorway and made it hers. Here's the new Bible verse, Ecclesiastes 3 verse 1 KJV. To everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under the heaven. Why this verse? Emma understood the power of timing. She allowed herself to be underestimated, mocked, and overlooked, not because she lacked the strength to speak, but because she was waiting for the right moment to act. This verse honors her patience and the poetic justice that unfolded when her season finally came. Her purpose, hidden in silence, bloomed at the perfect time, humbling those who once believed she had none. That's the end of the story. What did you learn from this story? Drop your thoughts in the comment section. Leave a like and don't forget to subscribe and turn on post notification so that you'll be notified whenever we drop our next videos. Also, share this video to someone who might be interested. Thank you so much for watching.